Hello and good day to you. So today we are doing a video on the time series analysis ARIMA function, and the idea here is I'm going to take some GDP data on India and predict the future. You heard it here, folks. First, folks, I'm going to predict the future, and then I'm going to explain why we can predict the future using India's past GDP to predict its future GDP, and why that might be useful in a set of different circumstances, and also very briefly touch on concepts of long and short-term debt cycles as being the cause of cyclic change within systems. Well, not in all systems, but in this particular economic system that we're talking about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you doing it first and then discuss the outcome afterwards in more detail. So we're using the library forecast, Foxtrot, Oscar, Romeo, Echo, Charlie, Alpha, Sierra, Tango, and you need to go to Kaggle and look for World Bank data India if you want to follow along. And this is another video where I'm focusing on showing you that a method exists rather than trying to deep dive into the method and explain it in full detail. But so if you like what you see, this is all part of the wider general linear model toolkit, and so some of the stuff you've learned about regressions does apply here. But I would suggest, if you find this really useful and really important, I'm not going to deep dive into every single point at this stage. If it really interests you, I'd go and look it up in more detail. But we create this array of values, and then what we're going to do is we're going to look at the auto and cross covariance, and that gives you so auto and cross covariance is about a value can have correlation with itself. And what do I mean about that? Well, in simple terms, if you think of it like this, today's GDP gives you a good shot at trying to guess what tomorrow's GDP might look like, and so you might want to think about seeing values as a series of events in time. Now, let's look at the actual data first and see why that might be a problem. If I was just to say, well, this year the value was this, and next year the value was that, and I did a normal regression, drew a straight line, it would go up and up and up, and you can see that it's doing really well, and then it just goes down. And as you can sort of see, we've got it changes and it goes out of sync, but I would say every 6 years there's a shift in the direction of this data, and that's something important to pick up on, and it's something important to go and look into for these ARIMA data analysts. But it does produce a very interesting way of looking at this, that if you know the general auto covariance in your data as a method of looking at what is the effect yesterday, and you know what the cycle looks like in the wider data, it gives you a good chance at plotting and planning out for what we think might happen in the future. Now, as you can see, it doesn't quite work out here, but this is where it comes in. The other part of these sorts of ARIMA methods is you do have to plan and think for random events. But we can analyze the cycles by looking at the autocovariance differential value. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about this function, nor am I going to do much about the other PACF function, because while they're interesting, you could actually see that there was a cycle in the base data. But here's, look up help ACF and help PACF if you need some more information on those two. But they're two functions about auto-covariance to give you more information of what your cycle might look like. And you can see more powerfully here why I'm thinking it's a 6-year cycle, because and maybe we need to cut that down and say, well, I'm going to treat it as a 4-year cycle. And that might be one reason for you to look deeper at your data when you're analysing it. But this goes up to the year 2016. So last we saw in that GDP evaluation, GDP, I think it's GDP per individual, is going down. So India's becoming, poorer per person. And then we know that that's not necessarily the case of India today. It wasn't on a lower and lower trajectory because of this cyclic method. Though if we only use the covariance, auto-covariance of the data to predict future values, we wouldn't get the right result. So we do need to include a cycle. And the way to do that is to use this function ARIMA, which, if you want to look it up, help ARIMA. You pass it the array of the data in the right order, and you can give it the information about the order and the period. And I think, the most important thing here is deciding what period you want to use. Now, for obvious reasons, if you want to play around with that, you can do. But then let's have a look. If I was to do a prediction, and you can see why I say this is related to regressions in general, because you use the same function, predict, and in fact this uses a lot of the ideas of regression, but using the idea of what step in the cycle am I, and what was last year's value to do a prediction. So I've now got my prediction using the predict value, and let's have a look at, this is what our prediction is for the future for India. And as you can see, we could have been saying, well, it's just going to drop off the hill if we were just looking at one dimension. But when we've included this idea that there is a cycle, we think it is going to come back. So I know that's not the most in-depth review of ARIMA. You can make more prettier graphs than this, I'm sure. But it is interesting because from a very simple set of information, because if you notice about all our linear regressions previously, we have shown a prediction of a value knowing a whole other bunch of values that we know about that prediction. So if we know that about an economy, that you have a whole bunch of information about it, we can try and do a prediction on values using the Klein data. So if you went back to the previous video, you saw us build a function for the Klein data. But this is a way of doing it where all you have is a time series of data, over a set of years, and by looking for the behaviors in that data and looking for the larger cycles, you can get a prediction of what the future looks like. And this is powerful for economics. It's powerful for stock trading. People do use it in stock trading, though. I think when you do use it in stock trading, they don't just add. So within economics, they don't just add in usually one cycle. They'll talk about multiple cycles. So they'll talk about the larger yearly cycle. They'll talk about the short debt cycle, because if you think about it, as a company takes on debt, it's all spending, and that's improving the economy in the beginning. It then gets to a point where it's peak debt and it needs to pay itself off to survive. And ignoring zombie companies and companies that don't manage to do this, a company then builds all this infrastructure, which is wisely invested in, is the theory, and from the money it earns from that infrastructure pays off its debt. But there's a point in that cycle where it doesn't have any debt, so everybody will give it loads of money. And then when there's a point in that cycle where it has too much money, too much debt, and nobody wants to give it money, and it looks like it's got problems, and then it comes back alive again as it pays off its debt. That's a short debt cycle. And often what happens, even on the national economic level, is a bunch of companies sync up in that short debt cycle and causes problems when they're all overdrawn on their credit card bill, and then causes really good times when they've all paid off their credit card bill. There's then a longer debt cycle they talk about, which is the stuff where they talk about the Great Depression and stuff, because the idea being is, as we get away with maxing out our credit cards and paying it off, every time we do that, we become less risk averse. We start to think that we can always do that and we will get away with it and it's all fine. So because we think like that, we invest more, and the investors invest more, and the creditors are willing to offer more money. They're willing to offer money maybe cheaper, and all these things eventually lead up to a point where the whole global economy might be in too much debt, and eventually having problems. You get a Great Depression, because what other people might call a deleveraging. And what happens in a deleveraging is everybody then needs to pay off their credit card bill. And if that happens where everybody needs to pay off their credit card bill all at once, you have problems. So you can see why you might get cycles in economic data. You can see why, if I'm planning for Amazon and looking at packages, it might be interesting for me to look over a week or even a year and say, when are my staff least productive? Because if they're all least productive on Friday, I've got to ask, what is it about Friday that makes them less productive? But you can sort of see, when you think about it like that, why using the auto-covariance of your previous data value, you can predict tomorrow's data value, but that wouldn't work unless you take into account the cycles of the system you're in. I hope that makes sense. I hope that's useful for you. As I say, this isn't a deep dive into time series analysis. It's a frankly very interesting subject, of which I'm not in this video going into huge detail, but hopefully that was enough to make you think about it and be interested in it, in using it in other places. So many thanks, and have a good day and a good night. Bye.